Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for the day's webinar. We're here today because students are growing up in a world of constant headlines. Young people are encountering current affairs through social media, TikTok, and YouTube, often before adults have had the chance to provide context. So, the question for schools is no longer whether children should engage with tricky news topics, but how we help them do so safely, critically, and constructively. That's what our guests, Robert Poole and Richard Long, will be discussing in just a few minutes. But before I introduce you to our panel, just a bit of housekeeping. This is a collaborative session, so please do use the chat to share your thoughts. We'll also be hosting a Q&A segment towards the end of this webinar, so please pop any questions for Robert or Richard in the chat. This session is being recorded, and you'll receive a follow-up email tomorrow with the recording and CPD certificate. So now let me introduce you to our expert panel. First, Robert Poole is a qualified English teacher and head of PSHCE at Sharples School. He's also editor of Education for Tomorrow, the Journal of Progressive Education. He was voted a Big Issue Top 100 Changemaker in 2022 and awarded the Ron Todd Foundation Award for Social Justice in 2023. Welcome, Robert. Welcome back. And then Richard Long is a Key Stage 3 English lead at the British School of Brussels and has a whole school role focusing on the development of oracy. Richard is particularly interested in supporting the development of reading and writing for pleasure, as well as building critically literate news reading communities. Welcome to you, Richard. Again, welcome back. So great to have you both here. I can't wait to hear from you both, of course, but in a second, we're going to pose a question to our audience. We always do this to break the ice. My team's going to publish a poll on screen, which you should be able to see in a moment. And the question reads, how confident do you currently feel discussing difficult news topics with students? So very confident, somewhat confident, not very confident, or I tend to avoid these conversations. We'll give you a second to answer that. We'll take a look at the results before jumping right in. And here we go. So 82% of you have said somewhat confident, 9% very confident, and then 9% tend to avoid this conversation. So this is our starting point, and what we'll look to sort of redress and get some insights from Richard and Robert. So let's go right into the questions. I'm going to start with you, Robert, today, if that's okay. And just to kind of define what we're talking about today, what do we mean by, quote, big or, quote, difficult news in a school context, as you see it?
Hi, Mark. Great to be here again. So big or difficult news, what does it mean? I suppose, we could focus on the big, the big topics, the graphic content, the wars, the death, the misery around the world. And that is big news, difficult news to deal with, but it could be at a more local level. It can be anything that's sort of challenging those students' sense of safety or challenging their worldview. That could be, from personal, from their home, their hometown, their local area. So big or difficult news, it will vary context to context. It will vary classroom to classroom, pupil to pupil. Anything that, causes this anxiety, polarizes people. It could be political. It could be to do with the climate. It could be to do with war, religion, gender, sexuality. So a bit of everything, really. Anything could be difficult news, but it's current. It's in the ether. It's being discussed outside of our classrooms, and therefore we need to discuss it in our classrooms.
Wonderful. And just kind of using the context of the day and what we do, how does that intersect with kind of addressing that kind of topic, those kind of difficult topics as you see it?
You're playing a balancing act whenever you're discussing these topics. We need to educate, we need to provide the knowledge to our pupils. We want to be fair, we want to be balanced, and we want to be accurate. I think if I was going to give advice to anyone about challenging these, it's do your research. You need to go in there armed with the knowledge beforehand. And I think often that's why, as teachers, we avoid some of these difficult stories. So, the day is perfect for that. You can have a read of it. You can read the different reading levels. You can read the footnotes at the bottom. You can dig deeper into it, and you can come armed with some of that knowledge. And you don't have to be an expert. That's provided for you. there's also going to be a challenge, in teaching in British schools in the context of impartiality within education. We have a duty to be impartial. Now, that doesn't mean to be impartial doesn't mean you can't have an opinion. To be impartial doesn't mean that you have to, both sides equally on things. But it does mean that, we can look at both sides of the argument. I think it's important to do so. Don't shy away from these things. And with the day that it is going to come at, it is an impartial news source. Whereas we don't always see that, from the regular mainstream media.
Understood. Yeah, that's good. And then maybe just over to you, Richard, and I'll come back in a second to you, Robert. How can teachers embed engagement with current affairs into the school culture?
Hi, yeah, thanks, Matt. Hello to everyone, and thanks, Robert, as well. I think what I'm about to say will chime with some things that Robert said already as well. I think in your question there, Matt, a key word was school culture. For me, it's about engaging confidently with students and feeling confident about that ability to discuss difficult topics is about your school culture. It's about your classroom culture. It's about an oracy culture as well. And I can't stress this enough. And of course, that oracy culture is tied in with your classroom and school culture in terms of how your school regards student voice, the value that you give to student voice, wanting to hear it, wanting to know what students think about the world and the issues going on within it, wanting to know what they think about themselves in relation to those issues as well. But I think I can't stress enough how developing that culture of oracy is key to enabling a kind of environment in which talk about news can thrive as well. Where there can be safety, of where students know how to express things in a way which works in good debate, in arguing, where they're able to understand how to choose vocabulary carefully. And that's where I think a lot of the articles with the day really help, in that development of vocabulary about news topics. We did a case study with you recently, of course, which I don't know if people have seen some of the results of that, but I know you can share that, Matt, at the end of this session. But I just want to talk about that case study a little bit because it was around the topic of the manosphere, which I know was a huge article with the day at around the same time, of course, as the release of the Louis Theroux documentary on this. What was quite exciting for us as a school who've been involved with the day was. And there's something interesting I just want to say here about flexibility in the curriculum, and again, how you create culture around responding to news or reacting to news with students. Because, of course, from a lot of what I hear of teachers using news in the day, it maybe happens in form time or within dedicated PSHCE time, for example. As an English teacher, I am happy to interrupt my English curriculum at any given moment in response to news that is happening around the world, or because it may well be things that we talk about that relate directly to, our English curriculum and so on. And I think that's just an interesting point to think about. Where do we have these conversations in the curriculum in school, and how do we have them? And the case study that we did was a wonderful opportunity to go, right, well, we're going to look at this article on the manosphere from the day. But we needed a full hour to do that. And as it was, I stepped in English curriculum time and I said, this matters. It's important. It will have an impact on not only what we do in English, it will have an impact on students' voice, the development of their oracy skills, and it will have a knock-on effect across the curriculum as well, of course, because this is talking about significant issues that could relate to a number of subjects. What was really interesting was the kind of pedagogical approach behind this session as well that we did. I mean, I did this with year groups, year 8, year 10, year 11, year 12, and year 13. And the kind of pedagogical approach to this, very much like you might do with other curriculum learning, was, okay, what do students currently know about this? So what we did in the session was say, okay, sorry, my lights have just gone. I'll just move slightly. What we said in the session was, okay, what do students currently understand about the manosphere, about gender, about identity, and masculinity. No, misogyny. Sorry, misogyny was another key term there. And of course, you provided us with a questionnaire to help do this. It was a Microsoft form. Students have filled in on a scale of 1 to 10 how they felt about some of these topics, how confident they felt about discussing these at the moment. So it was a questionnaire that not only explored their knowledge of these topics already, but also their knowledge of also their feelings about talk and how confident they felt about talking about this with each other in this environment. So you can see again how oracy and talk is key, and that classroom culture of that is key to kind of developing, help good conversations about news. From those pre-article questions, we then of course read the article, and I do want to stress this as well about great lessons. We just had an article. Teachers sometimes, we spend a lot of time planning lots and lots of things and resources. This was an article which ran a whole lesson and could have run lots more. And it was wonderful. And, I think where we're giving students voice, and where, there's lots of discussion, this fired lots of discussion, of course, students were fascinated in this. In terms of their, it's interesting, of course, because there's been, adolescence, of course, as a program recently. We might have thought that Andrew Tate had been kind of fizzling out a little bit, but what was very interesting was to see how students responded to this article in terms of their knowledge of male influencers on their online. They hadn't necessarily heard generally across those year groups. Most students hadn't heard of the term manosphere yet. So this was new to them kind of with that article in the day. Also, a number of students had not heard of the term misogyny. Now we know how much this matters, and we know I've seen, schools in the UK and online and teachers reporting about misogynistic attitudes that exist and go on within school cultures. And I think we make a mistake if we think that students who've moved on from Andrew Tate. So I think what this article revealed and the talk about this article was that this is still very much something which is definitely within their culture. What was really interesting about the article was some of the language used in it, about terms like, mogging and gym maxing, this language which really engaged students. And what we found afterwards in the post-article discussion, when the day also provided a questionnaire as a follow-up to the post-article discussion, is that we found that, there was, I think, a 17% boost in students feeling confident about talking about these issues. There are all kinds of other statistics to come out of that as well, which I know will be on the information you can provide, Matt. But it was a fascinating way of dealing with a topic which is so important, I think, that we are discussing right now. And in terms of difficulty, well, I mean, some of the things that students shared and opened up about, I had boys open up about their feelings of self-image, about their feelings of worth in front of others who have never spoken up in the curriculum before on other kind of, curriculum topics, for example, in English, or who find it challenging too. But the moment you started engaging them in things that they definitely had, were aware of, were seeing out there online, that they felt that their voice mattered, that they were being given that opportunity to share that voice, then it was eye-opening. And in terms of understanding those students better, developing relationships with them better, knowing them better, it was just a fantastic experience, and one which, we want to continue.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a great soundbite, this idea of how does your school value student voice, and then that connection to oracy, because clearly without that, those sentiments wouldn't have come out from those students. That's really powerful stuff. I'm going to go back to Robert now. It's kind of a two-parter, Robert. And maybe one of them is a follow-up to some of the interesting things you had shared in the last bit. But so the question is really, how do you turn a complex news story and make it accessible for students? And then it's something more about the well-being of students, which is like, how does engaging with the news fit into that student well-being, so they're feeling good and safe, about themselves as well, or about the world?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with everything that Richard said, and oracy being the key part of it. Having the ability to speak and communicate is and it's such an integral part of our being a democratic citizen, you know, as a citizenship teacher as well, as a PSHCE and whatever else I teach. But, you know, being able to have that democratic engagement is so important. So I think if I'm planning a lesson, then, it's not PowerPoints, it's not necessarily textbooks and exercise books. It's starting with that we're going to be discussing here, we're going to be talking, and we're going to value your voice. So I think, if we're going to take, a lesson, you've got the articles from the day. I'd say the first thing to do is don't go in blind, read it, get a bit of background information. What do you know about it already? Sort of examine yourself, what do I know? What prejudices am I coming in with? What's the background of my students? What might they already know? And so, be prepared, be knowledgeable, and be ready for it. And then, take the article, maybe, a bit of pre-learning. What do we all know? Establish a bit of understanding. With the day article, I like to sometimes start with the question, start with the debate topic. And then we can revisit it at the end, and we can sort of see, has there been a change in ideas and understanding around this? So take that topic, read it through, discuss it, talk, stop, clarify. It's not just a reading exercise. It's about getting that understanding and making them feel valued. This is an opportunity for some pupils who perhaps wouldn't otherwise talk about these things. And as I said before, it is sometimes difficult, to understand where they're coming from. These pupils, they might have views which are diametrically opposite to ours. We might completely disagree with them, but it's not about stigmatizing them. It's not about shaming them. It's not about changing their opinions. It's about listening, because, oracy is as much about listening as speaking, questioning, well, where have you heard that? Where has this come from? What about this? Sort of, starting with that, the why and the what's, and, and building up from there. I think the key thing is, though, it can't be a one-off. If we decide suddenly today we're going to talk about an ongoing conflict, or the manosphere, if it just comes in as a one-off, the pupils aren't prepared for it. So make sure this is a regular part of your learning. I'm quite lucky at my school that we do provide time on the curriculum to discuss current affairs. So we have extended form times every morning, and one of them a week is given over to current affairs. As Richard said, though, I teach citizenship. I'm happy to sometimes, divert from the curriculum and discuss these things. So I think don't be too, don't be too embedded, with it, with what you have to do. If something needs to be discussed, then it needs to be discussed. There's sometimes, I know SLT can sometimes be a bit wary of this. Don't give it oxygen. Don't talk about Andrew Tate. And if we ignore it, it'll go away. But then you've got to question, well, where are they getting their information from? Well, they're probably getting it from TikTok, other forms of social media, from each other. So I think we do need to tackle this. But I think it is important that we have the training and the expertise to do this, and we feel confident, and we empower teachers to feel confident to be able to do this. Thinking about, the age appropriateness of the article. So the day will, we have the reading ages, and I know to an extent they are, it's not just the reading age, but the content in it would be sometimes, adjusted. And sometimes we get this wrong. I remember when the conflict in the Ukraine broke out, and it was my own children, their primary school was showing videos of this, and the children were coming home upset, because they hadn't been prepared for this. They hadn't, the teachers were trying to do the right thing. They were trying to provide some context and understanding, and they were going to news round. They were using age appropriate topics, but you've got to think it can't just be on its own in isolation. There has to be that discussion around it. And we talked about a safeguarding point of view. What support are you putting in place? Have you considered the children in the room? if we're talking about conflict, have any of these children come from backgrounds of conflict? If you're talking about domestic violence, it's impossible to account for everyone. And I'm not saying that we should avoid these, but it's about sensitivity and signposting support as well. So if we're coming, we're thinking about student well-being, that should be the number one priority.
And that's really, building on, what we just heard. So we're thinking about oracy, we're thinking about listening, questioning, safeguarding. And that's a really great way of putting it. I like how you said it's not really about shifting that opinion in that moment, but getting more curious and getting closer to it. So that's a really good place to land. And then this question for Richard, this is rubbing up against what I'm seeing lots of audience teachers talking about. And I think this is a really good place also to look is what are some of the concerns that teachers may have about discussing the news and how can they navigate these concerns? Because that might be a good takeaway for everyone to have today.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some of the messages coming through on the chat as well, Matt, and again, I fully support what Robert was saying about teachers, of course, developing their knowledge of news as well prior to maybe going into these sessions. I think because news is current, and because we all have different levels of knowledge of different news, I think as well, we shouldn't necessarily shy away from the opportunity to discuss what's current, even if we might not have what we feel is a confident knowledge of that. Because remember, certainly from the manosphere debate that I was telling you about, there is that idea that actually there are students in the classroom who are interacting with this more than we are online, and who are seeing this more than we are, and who will know more than we are, perhaps. And I think it's that thing of kind of, who is the expert in the classroom? And actually, when it comes to discussion of news and this kind of critical thinking and debate, that actually students' experiences and students' lived experiences and are so important to hear, that actually as a teacher, I think sometimes you can also go into those situations where it's like, okay, I'm going to mediate this discussion, but actually I don't need to actually put my point of view or knowledge across maybe right now or at this moment. It might be something to go away and look up further later. But actually we use that opportunity to together say, hang on a minute, what are the facts here? Let's find that out together. And that's where I think, things like the way the day uses citations and the way that we make students aware of those citations. When we get our students news writing for student voices with the day, one of the skills they develop in Key Stage 3, where we're doing it, is that the importance of reading around the topic, finding information, facts, and making citations about that, so that actually, and then we talk about reliability and authoritative voices and so on, that kind of thing. And so that's a really important part of that process. And I think going into that process with students and actually teachers going, well, hang on a minute, let's pause here. What can we find out to actually bring that, that factual important knowledge into this debate is a hugely important part of that process. And that actually you as the teacher are not seen as the authoritative voice on this. I think, I had a year 13 student from Palestine who we were doing current affairs in registration time, and we brought some news reading from the day into that. And I think he saw an article, about Israel and Gaza and the conflict. And he came up to me privately afterwards and he said, he let out about his anger about news bias and how he felt that, Palestine, from his point of view, wasn't being represented in the news in the right way or a factual way and so on, for example. Now, interestingly, he was a year 13 student. He had that maturity to not kind of, have that outburst perhaps there and then. He came and spoke to me afterwards, but he was angry and I could see that. Now, I didn't say, okay, let's not do that then. But actually, we used him in a subsequent lesson to share more of those views. He, and I checked with him and he was happy to. But again, it's about that student voice and about that opportunity for students to share their lived experiences of the world and bring that to the forefront of talk. And the students who listened to what he had to say and his experiences as a Palestinian was just fascinating and was a real opportunity that we could have shied away from, but instead it produced something really rich with and within other students learning from that experience, from his experiences as well. So I think that's important to mention as well in terms of dealing with tricky issues.
I mean,
It's about knowing your students, isn't it? It really is about knowing your students well.
yeah, and from that anecdote, the trust that you built to get that information, and then also to then share it out with the rest of the class. And I think that's a really good way of thinking about it, not thinking of these topics as being an authority on them because they're ever changing, they're fast moving, they're topical, but to get closer to it. And something you said about reading around the topics, that's a really good takeaway to think about. We have so many questions. They started right at the beginning of the chat. That's always a good sign. And we have plenty of time to get to them. So I think we're going to just jump right in. And I'll move over to you, Robert, back to you, I should say. This came right from Izzy at the beginning. And the question is, in a world of AI generated news, social media, how do you slow down and embed critical thinking given that the news moves so fast?
That's an interesting question. I think definitely, AI, misinformation, disinformation. People say we live in a post-truth society now, and I was speaking to a local politician, and he said the biggest challenge for him is that you used to be able to debate with people, but now the truth doesn't matter anymore. There's this idea that nothing is true or everything is true. So yeah, it is tricky, and I think it's about taking these topics, slowing down, breaking them down, looking at the wider context, getting the pupils, to dig deeper, and it requires that background, doesn't it, of the media literacy. Have you embedded media literacy and critical thinking within the curriculum so that they can digest this, they can look at these topics with a critical eye, and they can spot if they're being manipulated. I think having that space in the curriculum where you can choose to discuss this, and they know that this is a safe place to discuss it, and you can challenge some of these things. I often get people saying they'll put their hand up and they'll tell me something. And I said, where did you get this from? It was from TikTok. And you're like, right, okay. It's not necessarily wrong because it's from TikTok. But let's have a look. Shall we look into it? Shall we investigate it? Shall we think critically about it? Where's this come from? Is it true? Is it not? It's not just ignoring the facts. And if we're dismissive of this, there's a danger of then it just goes back into the echo chamber, doesn't it? They don't listen. They've not got a place in school to talk about it, but they can talk about it with each other, and this can lead to this conspiracy theories and this sort of thinking. So have those safe spaces for discussion. Teach the media literacy. Have that dialogic discussion with them around them. How do you know this? Why would they be telling you this? Is it a reputable source? And just make that space for it. Definitely.
Yeah, that's a great thing to emphasize, this idea of media literacy, reading around the topic, going back. And yeah, I like that comment. Like TikTok might not necessarily be wrong, but needs to be kind of corroborated with other news sources. So this is our second question from Stephen. This is more about deployment. How do you run these current affairs debates? We'll give this over to Richard. If you have a student who presents a view that would be a cause for concern, how would you approach that?
Again, I think it comes from a teacher's skill and ability to be able to talk about developing an appropriate vocabulary, perhaps, or intervening at moments. I think where you might need to say things like, should we think about our language use there? Is that the best, most appropriate term vocabulary to use? I think that's where the day is very helpful with its articles, because where we can develop that vocabulary around approaching difficult topics, then that's really important. Sorry, Matt, just remind me of what the question said again.
Yeah. So about the deployment of how you run the debates within your classroom, if you have a particular student who voices something that causes concern, how would you approach that as a way to, and you've kind of already addressed it a little bit about
Yeah,
getting clear on vocab, but how would you address that to kind of maybe keep the classroom a safe space for this kind of
yeah. I mean,
convo?
I think as teachers, as professionals, we know those moments where there are things that we need to shut down
Yeah.
then and there in an appropriate way. It might be something that you discreetly say, that's, something we'll follow up on, or I might talk to you about later. But right now, um, there is right now that I think we just have to make that call as teachers. That's not appropriate. I mean, I've been in situations where I've said, you know, let's not use that language, please. I mean, there will be things that come up, of course, that you might regard as kind of hate language, whether it be racist, sexist, um, homophobic, etc. And I think it's our place as teachers to be responsible professional citizens and actually, call that out and just say that's not appropriate right now. Should that happen? Because it can happen. I've been in conversations about race, for example, where students use language like them and us, and where you need to correct the use of that language. That's our responsibility, I think, as professionals and as adults in a situation where we're dealing with children learning about this and how to talk about this. There are then school systems in place, aren't there, beyond that lesson, beyond that situation, to then deal with that further with regards safeguarding, etc., measures and so on. But I think there's a bravery needed, and I don't think teachers need to panic or worry about it. If we're professionals, we do our job appropriately, then we should be dealing with that with the kind of language that is appropriate ourselves and that doesn't, add fire to situations that get out of hand. Um, Equally, if you need to cut it down completely, then you would stop that completely and perhaps move on or to something else and say we'll return to this at a later date when we've had a think about it further. But yeah,
Yeah.
I'm not, it's the same when I'm teaching English. I'm not, we have difficult topics all the time we come across in English, and I think um, as teachers, teachers across all subjects will do that, where they'll know professionally how to deal with those situations.
Yeah. Any tricky topic at times needs a cooling off period
Yeah.
because the nature of it would make it, yeah. So that's great. No, it's good to know. This question I'm going to pose to both of you because it's about um, tips for approaching difficult subjects, particularly with neurodiverse students. Are there any things that you could share that have been helpful in how you address topics when it comes to neurodiversity in any of your students? And that might be for Robert or whoever might maybe has a particular example that might spring to mind.
I think it's about knowing your pupils. I mean, something you could do if you know this is going to be something that's coming up, could you share the article with them in advance? Difficult if it's, the rapidly changing nature of news. Could you share it with the teaching assistant? Could you provide ways that they can communicate their ideas in other ways? Mini whiteboards, think, pair, share, discussing ways that they might feel more comfortable with. I mean, these are all things that could be relevant to anybody, if I'm honest, in any class. It doesn't necessarily pupils who are neurodivergent. But be sensitive of it. It's probably not the situation where you're going to be picking people to answer if you're discussing these difficult topics. Allow them, to come to it at their own space. Be ready to be patient and explain things, from other situations. Perhaps try to find ways that they might understand it. Be very clear about the topic. A few things you might do. I don't know if Richard's got any more experience of that.
That's a good one.
No, no, it's tied in with what you were saying, Robert, as well. And I think there was a question from Kerry in the chat about having 600 students and only seeing them once every so often. And I completely empathize and sympathize with that situation where teachers are in that. But if you are seeing those students and discussing news, when you do, for example, then I think when I say know your students, then I think just taking some time in that session to, if you just started the session by saying, okay, what's interesting you out there right now in the world? What's going on? What are you passionate? I know quite often we might struggle, students can struggle to say what they're passionate about, but but how often do we ask them that, actually? And so finding out things about their interest, their knowledge of the world before going into that discussion of news might just preempt some things, that you can think about carefully with regards to students before you then discuss that news further. So again, it lends itself to Orison, that idea of student voice and using those opportunities, even if it's once every so often, to just start by finding out a bit more about students' interests, concerns in the world, and then going into discussions from there. I hope, Kerry, that was some help.
Yeah, that's a great tip to just create that engagement, that curiosity, and kind of open up the conversation. That's great. This next question, we have still a few minutes, so we're going to try to get through all these questions coming through. As a fellow English and PSHCE teacher, do you feel like there's more expectation of us to talk about the news and other issues compared to other teachers and other subjects? If so, how might you address that? Maybe over to you, Robert, for that one.
I think definitely as a PSHE teacher, I'll get emails from, my deputy teacher, can we get this into the curriculum? And, it can be tricky too sometimes. I think I'm lucky that we do have a dedicated space on the curriculum for current affairs, but not everyone is as lucky. I think one thing I do is I drive people mad. I probably do is I go on the day and I'll read it. I read it daily, and I'll think, oh, that would help the geography department. I know they do about that.
Robert, try to jump in. I think we just lost your mic for a second. It might just be some interference. If you mute and unmute, it might course correct. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, can you hear me?
Perfect. Maybe start over that one because you were on to something.
Yeah. So I was saying that. I'm lucky that we do have a space on the curriculum for current affairs, but I know not everybody is that lucky. I do often get asked to sort of try and integrate things into my lessons, and that can be quite difficult, especially when we do have a PSHE curriculum. So you can be reactive, but it's not always possible. In citizenship, I have, we've said we're not going to do the lesson today because they want to discuss the Iran conflict. You can go, well, actually, this does link into the curriculum. But you have to know your curriculum inside out to be able to do that. And you know how it fits. And that can be quite difficult, especially when we don't always have specialist PSHE teachers or citizenship teachers, people who are teaching outside of the subject specialism. What I do sometimes do is, and I'm saying when I was muted, I drive people mad by going on the day, and I'll be forwarding things to people, this is a maths article, I'll forward that to the head of maths, I'll forward this article about the climate to the head of geography, and, allow them to, make it easy for them to integrate these things into their subjects as well. Because I don't think it is just the responsibility of our subject. It's the same as literacy and oracy and media literacy, all of these things, they should be cross-curricular, and it only works when they're cross-curricular. They shouldn't think that this is the lesson where we talk about the news. I want them to be able to go into the geography lesson and go, I saw an article about flooding or whatever it might be. So yeah, if you've got an ambassador for the day in your school, can they share things? Can you do training with staff from other departments so they can share things? But yeah, I don't think it should just be the responsibility of the English staff or the PSHE staff, even though I know often it can be.
It feels like that. Great. And then a couple more questions. We're going to go through these. Richard, how do you navigate the influence of parents and the home environment when managing the news in the classroom? Does that come up?
Yeah, I've seen it. I've seen it actually come up more through curriculum experiences when I've been discussing text there in English, for example. actually than I've experienced with news articles. And it is a challenging one because there are, working in an international school as well with many different cultures. We've got over 70 nationalities here, with, where there'll be different belief systems and cultures that students come from. It can be a challenge, but I think, we stick to the values that we live by here at the school and are promoting, that we'd hope all human beings live by. And I think there have had to be those. I think I have had a situation where it was clear that a student had views which might be considered racist, for example, and that those were views that might have come from a home situation as well. So in that case, I did communicate with parents, and did talk about what we'd been talking about, and made that kind of intervention there at that stage. But again, I think it's something that shouldn't necessarily stop us from shying away from discussing these topics. It's finding out those things actually, that come up through news discussion and tricky discussions that I think actually is very beneficial to developing that knowledge of those students, of their backgrounds, that enables that communication with parents, which actually is, I think, something we should be doing and not something that we should be fearing or running away from. So yeah.
That's great. No, that's really interesting. And then this is our final question before we say goodbye. How do you overcome the reluctance of staff to deal with tricky topics? And I'll leave that one with you, Robert. How do you kind of get the rest of the school on board?
I think it's about like I said before, make it easy for them. I think you've always got to remember that teachers are busy, marking, curriculum planning, all the other admin that's involved. So make it easy for them. So, like I said before, sharing the articles from the day, offering training on the day, and making them feel comfortable with it, and making them have the confidence to be able to teach it. And I think it's about, we've had before, well, we won't talk about this because that's for the history department to do, or this conflict could be better taught by these experts. And I think it's about having those discussions, with SLT and, with your team, with the staff, about how can we embed this as a culture within the school, where people are comfortable. And speak to those staff. Why are you not comfortable teaching this? Why are you not comfortable delivering this topic? Is it worry of offending people? Is it a lack of knowledge around the topic? Is it their own personal beliefs? Is it worry about political impartiality? And there's, there's lots of reasons why people would feel, that it is tricky. And maybe get them to come to a webinar from the day about it, and they could feel more confident. So it's providing that reassurance, the CPD, and the knowledge, and also accepting that some staff might struggle to talk about some of these topics, and that's okay as well. If they don't, we don't want to put a member of staff in a situation where they, it could reignite traumatic experiences for them. Would we ask a victim of domestic violence to discuss a topical news topic about domestic violence? Well, you perhaps wouldn't, would you? So, having that openness in the discussion and the safeguarding in place, and also the safeguarding for your staff as well.
I like how you kind of landed back on this idea of culture change or creating a culture creation of, tackling tricky topics. So that's just part of the school's fabric. And that kind of links up to, what Richard was saying about valuing student voice, that culture in the school that says that voice matters and how that plays into ORC. So there have been a lot of takeaways. These have been really good insights from both of you. So just in the interest of staying on track with our 45 minutes, I should say, that really does bring us to the end of the session. So thank you so much to both of you for your time. Very, fantastic insights, and a big thank you to our audience for all those questions. We had a lot to get through, and they were really good ones. So thank you so much. Just as a reminder, we'll be sharing the recording of the webinar as well as your CPD certificates tomorrow afternoon. So please do share the recording with your peers who might have missed today's session. They can rewatch it, of course. We'd also like to let you know about the day's summer offer. When you sign up for the day in May, you'll get the summer term totally free, which is a great offer. So soft launch the day at your own pace and start September fully prepared. The team right now will pop some more information in the chat about how to do that. So thank you again, Richard and Robert. Welcome back, because for anyone who already knows, Robert and Richard have joined us before. It's always great to see you, and we hope to see you again. We'll be releasing the details of our next webinar very soon, so stay tuned for that, and I hope to see you there. Have a great evening, everyone. Thank you again.